If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode. In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. On the morning of July 13th, 2012, two young cousins, 10-year-old Lyric Cook-Morrissey and 8-year-old Elizabeth Collins, set out for a bike ride in the quiet town of Evansdale, Iowa, and never came home. Their bicycles and purse were found abandoned, sparking a massive search effort that gripped the community and the nation. Months later, their remains were discovered in a remote area over 20 miles away. For years, the case has seemed to stall, and the girls' families in Evansdale have been left with more questions than answers. But in recent years, with the 2022 arrest and subsequent conviction of Richard Allen in the Delphi, Indiana murders of two other girls, hope has been reignited. While there is no evidence those cases are connected, the similarities are undeniable. And if justice can be served in that case, even after all the time that had passed, it can happen for Lyric and Elizabeth too. In today's episode, we will be diving into this heartbreaking case, going over the timeline, the investigation, and the recent developments in the case that are bringing us hope. Let's get started. This case brings us to Evansdale, Iowa, a town of 4,500 people just under an hour north of Cedar Rapids. 10-year-old Lyric Cook-Morrissey and 8-year-old Elizabeth Collins were cousins. Elizabeth's parents are Heather and Drew Collins, and Lyric's parents are Misty Cook and Dan Morrissey. Heather and Misty, so Elizabeth and Lyric's mothers, are sisters. This is how they're related. Wilma Cook is Elizabeth and Lyric's grandmother, Misty and Heather's mom. Now, Lyric and Elizabeth were cousins, but according to Elizabeth's mother, Heather, the two definitely had more of a sibling-type dynamic. They were very close. And though they were often stubborn and had sibling-like rivalries, when they got along, they really got along. Heather said in a 2022 KCRG TV9 interview that Lyric would stay at their house often to have sleepovers, and that occasionally Elizabeth would also stay at Lyric's house. Now, on July 13th, 2012, Lyric and Elizabeth were together, as they often were, and their grandmother Wilma Cook was watching them. And I'm pretty sure they had been playing at Elizabeth's home because Heather said she had been out running errands, which is why her mom Wilma was there helping watch them. Around noon, Elizabeth and Lyric went off on a bike ride, and Wilma told the press she last saw the girls riding their bikes near downtown Evansdale around 12:15 p.m. I don't know exactly where the home was, so if they lived right near downtown Evansdale, my guess would be that they left right around that time to ride their bikes. A short time later, Heather got back home from running her errands, and the kids weren't home. And what she didn't realize at the time, but would learn later on, was that Wilma let the kids ride their bikes further than they were normally allowed to. Heather said that the two would often go ride their bikes and that they had a specific area that they were allowed to ride them, but that this time they rode further. Now, I don't know if Wilma let them ride their bikes further or if she just didn't know that this set boundary existed. Either way, at a certain point, they became concerned enough that the two weren't back that at least Heather and Wilma began looking for Lyric and Elizabeth. Misty, Lyric's mom, said around 1 p.m. she got a call from her mom Wilma that they couldn't find Lyric and Elizabeth and that she needed to get there to help look. Misty had just gotten off work at a new job she had and went to help look as well. Heather said they checked in the spots they'd most likely be, the park, friends' homes, wherever they had played before, but they weren't there. At this point, Heather has a feeling that something is wrong, and she tells Drew she is calling police. Misty thought it had been about 15 or 20 minutes of looking before police were called. It was definitely longer than that because, according to a timeline posted by Jeff Reinitz in the Gazette, which was based off of notes by Evansdale Police Chief Kent Smock, the girls were officially reported missing at 2:48 p.m. Over the next hour, a flurry of activity is happening. There is no delay at all in police getting involved and searching. Evan, Elizabeth's father, goes with police to drive around and search. Other officers begin searching Elizabeth's home, and presumably Lyric's, though I don't know that for certain. And at 3:15 p.m., more officers are called in, and the fire department's assistance is requested, and they begin checking bike trails. Around 4 p.m., Heather received an update, and this is her in an interview.
He went on with Kent Smock, who was the chief of police at the time. He went on a ride with him and sent me a picture and said, "Is this Elizabeth's?" It was a Hannah, Montana purse. It had been thrown up over a fence. And I was like, yeah. I'm like, she's gone. I'm like, they're gone. I'm like, we need to put out an Amber Alert. They would. So if you don't, it's been changed now, but if you don't see a person taking a kid or a vehicle at that time, they couldn't do an Amber Alert. So it was nonstop Facebook posts and, police and everything got involved and that kind of stuff. And the next day just searching. Everybody's searching, nonstop, And I just remember that night first night, it was just like sitting on our porch, just like waiting by the phone, please, Lord, let them come home, and they didn't. It was just a nightmare. But it still, to me, is a nightmare, I know, to me, time doesn't heal, it just makes it worse.
A firefighter had located Lyric and Elizabeth's abandoned bikes about a mile from the Collins home along a trail that surrounded Myers Lake. The bikes were found in an area in the southeastern corner of the lake, hidden by trees and brush, and approximately 40 feet from the interstate. The Hannah, Montana purse had been found thrown over a fence separating the trail from the lake. Her cell phone, which reportedly was only used for games and music, was also found at the scene. There was additional evidence located nearby, but to date, what that was has not been released. But an investigator close to the case told KCRG TV9 that right away it was obvious the girls had been abducted. The finding of the purse, bikes, and cell phones was just the beginning of the nightmare Lyric and Elizabeth's families have had to endure since. Heather said she wanted an Amber Alert to be issued, but like she said, one never was. Because at the time, the circumstances didn't qualify for an Amber Alert. She explained this a little bit in that clip. The previous criteria said that you needed to have enough descriptive information about the child, the abductor, and or the suspect's vehicle to believe an immediate broadcast would help. Because at the time they didn't have any information on the abductor or a vehicle, one wasn't issued. In 2013, in large part because of the abduction of Lyric and Elizabeth, and because of the abduction of two other girls we will talk about later, the criteria was changed and training was issued so that the criteria could be interpreted more broadly. In the reading of the new criteria, which is largely the same, there doesn't need to be descriptive information about the abductor or a vehicle. They really just took out the and or portion of that last bit of the criteria. So the four things you now need. Number one, law enforcement confirms a child has been abducted and entry has been made into the Iowa NCIC systems identifying the child as missing. Number 2, the child is under the age of 18. 3, law enforcement believes the circumstances surrounding the abduction indicate that the child is in danger of serious bodily harm or death. And 4, there is enough descriptive information about the child, abductor, or the suspect's vehicle to believe an immediate broadcast alert will help. So an Amber Alert wasn't issued in the case of Lyric and Elizabeth, but the search goes on in full force. Like Heather said, she was posting frantically on Facebook, trying to get the word out as quickly as possible in hopes of someone finding them. There is also so much more happening throughout the course of the day, so let's talk about the initial search efforts on July 13th. At 4:30 p.m., the girls' names are entered into the National Crime Information Center, a nationwide FBI database that includes missing persons, and the fire department began dragging Myers Lake. 10 minutes later, while not the same as an Amber Alert, County Emergency Management begins sending automated messages to phones in the area to alert residents, and by 5 p.m., a canvass of multiple neighborhoods had begun. What we find out later, and according to a case summary and timeline compiled by Jody Ewing with IowaColdCases.org, the girls were seen around 12:23 p.m. on Brogan Boulevard in Evansdale, and between 12:30 and 1 p.m., they were spotted on Gilbert Drive, which is not far from Myers Lake, which was a popular fishing area. So a picture is starting to form, and a timeline is beginning to be narrowed down. At the same time, officers begin the process of questioning and getting information from Lyric and Elizabeth's parents. They got photos of the girls from the parents that were distributed to the media by 5:30 p.m., the same time that divers and volunteers arrived at the lake. By 6:30 p.m., law enforcement and civilians began searching wooded areas, which went on until 3:30 the next morning. At 7 p.m., an Iowa State Patrol airplane with infrared capabilities joined the search, and authorities began interviewing locals on the sex offender registry. At 8 p.m., the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were notified, and the FBI was brought in. Another Iowa-based search and rescue team was also contacted. By 8:30 p.m., the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children began emailing and faxing photos and descriptions of the girls to truck stops, stores, and other public areas within a 100-mile radius of Evansdale. On Saturday, July 14th, the search for the missing girls continued and intensified. The DCI and FBI arrived early that morning, while civilian volunteers resumed searching until nightfall. Law enforcement canvassed the neighborhood, seized the parents' phones and computers, and brought in the FBI's Child Abduction Response Team. Cadaver dogs searched Myers Lake, and registered sex offenders in the area were located and interviewed. Divers returned to the lake, press briefings began, and the Iowa State Patrol's infrared plane conducted more flights. That night, law enforcement began methodically searching area dumpsters, a process that continued overnight, and alerted garbage companies to secure dump locations in the landfill. By Sunday, July 15th, law enforcement operations moved to Pointer School, which served as their kind of command post for nearly a month. The FBI's data management team joined, staying through early September. Civilian searches, law enforcement interviews, polygraphs, and canvassing continued, and law enforcement continued focusing on sex offender interviews. They also continued searches of dumpsters in the area. On Monday, July 16th, the search expanded to include having law enforcement accompany trash haulers on their routes, with special landfill protocols put in place for Evansdale trash. The draining of Myers Lake began, and FBI bloodhounds were requested. The Tuesday, July 17th search efforts mirrored previous days. They had interviews, polygraphs, focused searches, and sex offender checks. Sewer lines were examined using cameras, and that evening, FBI bloodhounds scoured the area. The next day, trash collection efforts, interviews, neighborhood searches, and offender interviews continued. Press briefings provided updates to the public twice daily, and that afternoon, the FBI's sonar-equipped dive team confirmed plans to search Myers Lake. The investigation pressed forward on Thursday with more interviews, polygraphs, and continued checks on registered sex offenders. The press briefings were pretty consistent, happening at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. each day. That evening, the draining of Myers Lake, which had started days prior, was officially halted. On Friday, July 20th, the FBI dive team conducted a thorough search of Myers Lake while law enforcement expanded ground searches to areas within a 15-mile radius. More interviews, polygraphs, and sex offender checks happened, and by noon, vehicle checkpoints were established in the area. And that evening, investigators publicly confirmed their primary focus had shifted fully to an abduction scenario, as other possibilities had been ruled out. Now, throughout this entire time, both Lyric and Elizabeth's families are being heavily investigated. And this is absolutely common. We know the statistics. Kids are much more likely to be abducted by a family member or someone who knows them, as opposed to a stranger. So it makes sense that they were being looked at. Heather said their phone records were heavily scrutinized. They handed in their computers. Police went over every detail, verifying who was where and at what time, all of that. And Heather was happy to hand all of that over. But according to Heather, Misty and Dan were not cooperative with police. Heather said Misty was MIA during the initial search. She said they wouldn't talk to police and didn't know if they even let them search their homes, and that each evening at 5 p.m. they would have a meeting to go over the searches and all of the efforts that were going on, but neither Misty or Dan would show up. In this case, Misty Cook and Dan Morrissey have been heavily scrutinized, and this is because of drug and legal troubles both of them had at the time and continue to have. Just the day before Lyric and Elizabeth disappeared, Dan appeared in court for a hearing on 4 cases. 3 of them were drug-related, and 1 was an assault charge. The drug charges were marijuana and meth-related, and the assault charge was related to a domestic abuse incident where he was arrested after police said he threw Misty to the ground, smashed her face into the floor, put his knee over her neck so she could barely breathe, and also broke her finger. Dan was ordered to have no contact with Misty because of this incident, though the order was modified after the girl's disappearance so that the two could be together as needed for the investigation into the girl's disappearance, but while police were also present. Misty has struggled with substance use as well, but she has been very upfront about her criminal history and her struggles. And despite Heather's comments that Misty was MIA and not cooperative with police, Misty said she was completely transparent with police, even providing them names and contacts for people she had dealt drugs with in the past.
I'm just being really open about that, because I'm sure that's going to come up, because I do know how judgmental people will be, and I know how people think and operate, and that's okay. It was okay with me. My past is my past. I've dealt with it, and I've paid my time in so many different ways. I knew that I didn't have anything to do with this, and my only desire was really just to put everything out on Front Street so that, you know what I mean, we could do our best at finding where these girls were. You know, I mean, there were people that I had dealt drugs with in the past that I said, these are the people I bought drugs from. And, you know, and I told those people, I was like, hey, I let the cops know that we'd had interactions in the past, and they don't care about that. They just want to know as much information as they can to anything that could lead to finding them. And anybody that I had ever associated with was completely fine with that.
In the years since this case began, Misty has been arrested and jailed multiple times for drug charges, and honestly, I think she's received way too much criticism over the years. Not only is drug addiction incredibly difficult to get past, but add in the incredible trauma of losing a child and the intense public scrutiny that comes with it, it would make it that much more difficult. But I absolutely understand the level of scrutiny on them for the purposes of the investigation. Their pasts were looked into, their contacts, acquaintances, they took multiple polygraph tests, all of it. Investigators did say that Dan and Misty were not considered suspects in the girls' disappearance, and that they were looking into their backgrounds and the backgrounds of their associates to be thorough and not to discount any possible leads. The days of searching turned into weeks and months, and there was still no sign of the girls. I cannot imagine the absolute trauma and heartbreak of months and months going by without knowing where your child is or if they were safe. Both Heather and Misty talk about their thoughts during this time. This is Heather.
And really, it was all day thinking, how, if they're not dead yet, how are these people treating them? So that was really, really hard. It still is. How are these people treating them? They obviously didn't take them to, ride bikes, I really did they get to go to the bathroom, or did they have to sit there and urinate themselves? Did they, it was so hot out, Did they give them anything to drink? Did they, if they were still, alive, a week or two later, did they feed them? How have they hurt them? Have they, smacked them around? Have they, abused them sexually? And I try to stop myself. After these years, I really just pray for the Lord to take those thoughts. Because I want to say every day for, 5 years, every day, and I still do. And I try not to, and I try to stop myself, and I just pray. Because you don't ever want to think your baby's hurting. You don't ever want to think your kids are hurting. They get a fever, you feel, so bad when they get a fever or something. And someone just takes them and does whatever with them because they think that they have a right, and they don't.
This is Misty.
So I just know during that 5 months, in my mind, I thought the worst. So if it was raining, I thought maybe they were outside in the rain, tied up, being beaten. So I would stand out in the rain. It was hard to eat because I didn't know if they were eating. So if they weren't eating, I didn't want to either. It is very hard to escape the mind when you believe somebody to be out there with someone that is wanting to cause harm and only harm to someone else. And so it almost, it was, it's just really more than the mind or the emotions can handle.
After months and months of no answers, on Wednesday, December 5th, 2012, the parents were called to a meeting downtown in Evansdale. Drew Collins said in an interview in the HBO documentary series Taken Together that he immediately knew something was wrong. He said if the girls had been found alive, they would have been transported to the Iowa City Children's Hospital to be tested. But the meeting was being held in Evansdale. He said they must not be alive. When Police Chief Kent Smock arrived at the meeting, Drew could tell by the look on his face that they were gone. What was learned was that hunters came across 2 bodies in the Seven Bridges Wildlife Park in rural Bremer County, Iowa. This was a wildlife area that was about 25 miles north of where the girls were last seen. The hunters contacted law enforcement at 12:45 p.m. Lyric's father, Dan, said he got the call to come to the meeting in Evansdale, but he didn't want to lose the hope that he had, so he didn't go. His mother eventually called and told him the news. Officials held a press conference on December 6th and told the public of the finding, and on Monday, December 10th, the state medical examiner's office confirmed the bodies were Lyric and Elizabeth. To date, there has been no information released on their cause of death. The only thing that police have released relating to the bodies is the confirmation that it's them, and a few other details that we'll talk about later. Now, Misty and Dan did potentially view Lyric's body, though I don't know to what extent. In the KCRG interview, Misty expressed that she had a very hard time believing it was Lyric, and for a long time she believed she had been misidentified. She said she's never seen a police report detailing how the bodies were found, has never been told the cause of death, and has never been told how specifically the bodies were identified. She said that on the 5th, when the bodies were discovered, she had received a phone call from Kent Smock, the police chief, prior to the meeting they had where they were officially told of the finding. And Kent asked Misty if Lyric had her fingernails painted. She said she didn't believe Lyric ever really had her nails painted. Kent pressed further and asked if she would have had a zebra print on her fingernail. Misty said absolutely not. It just wasn't something she thought Lyric would have. She said after the in-person meeting, she went to the funeral home and saw her finger and the zebra stripes on one of the nails. She was adamant that Lyric didn't have that on her fingernail when she left her the morning she went missing, and she was certain it wasn't Lyric. I think she did eventually move to accept that it was Lyric, but I'm sure you would just cling to anything at all, that nothing could convince you that the absolute worst has happened to your child. Now the discovery of the bodies, I really think marked a turning point for the relationship between Lyric and Elizabeth's families. You do see how tragedies like this can force couples and families apart, and that was definitely the case here. Heather and Drew did end up divorcing. Heather said in an interview it was just hard for them to stay connected when their grieving styles were so different, but they seemed to remain supportive of one another. Heather said for her own mental health, she has Drew be the primary person police contact with any updates. She said she just couldn't take the process of getting her hopes up when they'd be told of a new lead and then having it not work out. The relationship, though, between Heather and Misty does seem to have completely deteriorated. Misty said in an interview she understands and doesn't blame anyone, that anger and confusion drove the families apart. She said she remembers being very suspicious of people she even knew. She said when you're being told the statistics, that it's someone you know or it's a family member, you definitely start to question and wonder, did they have something to do with it? For Heather, it seems like the initial scrutiny into Dan and Misty because of their drug use and legal troubles fueled her suspicions, along with her perception that they weren't cooperating with police, and ultimately Misty's decision to have Lyric's body cremated. This is Heather.
So just things like, her body cremated, her, their resistance to talk, They didn't care if they were using drugs. That was the least from DCIs. They don't care. They just wanted to talk about their daughter and niece, that's all. They wanted to talk about that day, just questions, normal questions that they ask. They interrogate you. They want you to do a, whatever, I can't think of now, the truth test, whatever it is. I can't think of it now. But they want you to do that. They want you to polygraph. They want you to be polygraphed. They want your phones. They want your records. They want, any, device you have. If you have a computer, they want it, They wanted to know, they looked in Elizabeth's room, just stuff like that. I'm sure they didn't get a chance to look in Lyric's room because they were together at that time. But, so it just, all those things that, you start putting together, it's hard not to think, how much a part did they have of this, not like them taking them, but what part of the drugs had somebody do this,
Misty has maintained that she was cooperative with police and did reveal that since December of 2012, she hasn't been contacted by investigators at all.
How often do investigators talk to you now?
So investigators, since I moved since December, since we buried him in 2012, have never talked to me.
What?
Never. They've never contacted me. Not once.
And they had you do polygraphs. They interviewed you in the early weeks and early months. But after the bodies were found, nothing?
Never. Not one time.
Have they communicated with Dan, do you know? Have they communicated with Elizabeth's family?
No.
Why the difference?
I don't know if it's just the same, like, persona that just carried through those 5 months, and the police acted the same way as the public. It's not all the public, but I mean, you know what I mean? Some. But their interest in us at that point was none, and I don't know if we just served their purpose to that degree and they didn't need anything more from us, or, I mean, I guess I really don't have an answer for you. I just know that I've never heard from anybody, and it sure wasn't hard to find me for quite a while, seeing as I ended up back in prison. They knew where I was.
I do think that over the years, the focus of this case has been so heavily on the dynamics between the parents and their relationship, and on the issues Misty has had with substance use. It's incredibly unfortunate too, I think, especially looking at how the media has portrayed and reported on Misty's continued struggles with addiction. In my research on this case, there looked to be an equal amount or more reports of Misty relapsing and being charged with drug-related issues than there were on articles focusing on the case, calling for tips from the public, all of that. There were so many articles that, in substance, were only related to Misty being arrested on drug charges, but the article would be titled something like, quote, "Misty, mother of murdered 10-year-old Lyric Cook, arrested on meth charges." There would be zero information in the report suggesting that there was a connection between the arrest and who was responsible for the murder of the girls. They just appeared to be reporting on it, including Lyric's name, in my opinion, for more attention and clicks. People being arrested on drug charges happens every day. Millions of people struggle with drug addiction every year. There's nothing newsworthy about Lyric's mother being arrested for something like that, especially when investigators have said they are not considered suspects. But again, I can understand the magnified look at Dan and Misty's contacts as it relates to the investigation, but I think it's really gross how their drug issues have been exploited by the media. It's only fueled speculation and rumors, hasn't helped the investigation from what we know, and also just further stigmatizes drug addiction. As an end to discussing the family dynamics, I want to say that if you or someone you know is struggling with substance use or is in an abusive relationship or situation, there is help available. I will link to resources in the description of this episode. The discovery of the girls' bodies started a new phase in the investigation, trying to piece together what happened and find out who did this. When looking at the specific area the girls' remains were found, the overall location was used by hunters, and apparently this area had been searched after the girls disappeared, but that the specific location of the bodies was in a remote area of 7 Bridges that is not directly accessible by vehicles. Because of how remote the location of the remains was, investigators believed that the individual is familiar with the area. They knew it was used by hunters frequently, so they did investigate people with hunting licenses. In the HBO documentary series, Kent Smock said that the girls were wearing their shoes, which presents a possibility that the girls walked to the location, but he says it's always possible that they were carried. Additionally, he said all of their clothing was at the scene and that the girls were found together. This gave Dan Morrissey some comfort, that at least in the end they had each other. Investigators have never revealed if the girls were sexually assaulted, and official information hasn't been released on how long the girls were alive, but many, including Dan Trelka, the Waterloo chief of police, believe the girls were killed the same day they were abducted. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had been involved in the case since July of 2012 when the girls went missing, and an eventual profile was released, and I'll read that profile, which is based on information available up until July 17th of 2014. The following items are possible characteristics the suspect may have, however should not be considered factual, and the suspect or suspects may or may not possess one or all of the characteristics described here. The offender most likely acted upon an opportunity to abduct Lyric and Elizabeth when they were seen in the Evansdale area. The offender is familiar with both Myers Lake, Angels Park in Evansdale, and 7 Bridges Wildlife Area in Bremer County. The offender specifically chose Seven Bridges Wildlife Area because of the offender's familiarity with the area and the fact that it afforded the offender privacy needed to commit the crimes with limited risk of detection by others. The offender likely used some form of quiet coercion to garner Elizabeth and Lyric's initial compliance in leaving the park. This could have involved communication or a ruse or threats of violence. The offender blends in with and may be part of the Evansdale, Bremer, and surrounding communities. It's unlikely that the offender is a transient or someone who was merely traveling or passing through the area. The offender may have experienced stressors in the offender's life in the time period leading up to July 13th, 2012. These stressors may have included legal problems, psychological mental health difficulties, conflicts with their significant other or spouse, unemployment difficulties, or financial strain. The offender is likely following any media reports regarding the investigation, but may deliberately avoid discussions with others about the case or any public display of interest about the investigation. The offender may have attempted abductions in the past, and these attempts may have involved minor or adult victims. In the time period following July 13th, 2012, the offender may have made attempts to alter the appearance of the offender's vehicle. This may have involved cleaning the interior or exterior of the vehicle or permanently changing the appearance through painting or reupholstery. In the time period following July 13th, 2012, the offender may have made attempts to alter the offender's physical appearance to include changing hairstyle or color, growing or removing facial hair. The BAU case experience indicates that the vast majority of these types of offenses are committed by one offender. However, there are cases in which more than one offender was involved in some part of the criminal act. Therefore, the public is strongly encouraged to contact law enforcement with any suspicion involving a single offender, multiple offenders, or any individual they are suspicious of, whether or not the person possesses any of the characteristics mentioned above. The information is being released to the public in hopes it will assist the public to remember specific activities or characteristics of individuals around the date of the girl's abduction so that it can be reported to investigators. The public is warned to take no action on their own based upon these characteristics, but are asked to report their suspicions to law enforcement so they may be properly investigated and individuals' rights protected. Years have gone by and there have been no major breaks in the case. On the 10th anniversary of the girl's disappearance, the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation issued a press release reaffirming their continued work on the case, and that while no one has been charged or arrested for the crimes, investigators still have a dogged determination to understand what happened to Lyric and Elizabeth. At the time of this 2022 press release, they stated that nearly 2,000 leads had been investigated in the case, and that within the 10 months preceding that press release, they had received 117 tips from the public. In 2024, an HBO Max documentary series was released on the murders of Lyric and Elizabeth. It was a really great series, has a ton of information. I would highly recommend it. The second episode focuses on possible suspects and really centers on another double abduction that happened just a year after Lyric and Elizabeth. I had not heard of this case until this documentary series came out, and we will cover that next week. If you have any information at all about the circumstances surrounding the disappearance and deaths of Lyric Cook-Morrissey and Elizabeth Collins, the best way to submit a tip is to email Our Missing Iowa Girls at dps.state.ia.us. You can also call the Evansdale Police tip line or the Cedar Valley Crime Stoppers, and I will include both of those numbers and that contact email for tips in the description of this episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself.